From its founding in 330 CE, Constantinople was designed not merely as a capital, but as a geopolitical instrument. Its placement was deliberate, calculated to command the narrow maritime corridor linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and to control the intersection of Europe and Asia. Unlike earlier imperial capitals shaped by gradual urban growth, Constantinople was conceived as a strategic response to shifting imperial realities, where geography itself functioned as an extension of state power. The site of Byzantium, renamed Constantinople by Constantine I, occupied a triangular peninsula bounded by the Bosporus Strait to the east, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and the Golden Horn to the north. This configuration provided natural defenses on three sides, while also enabling direct oversight of maritime traffic moving between major economic zones. Archaeological surveys of harbor installations along the Golden Horn confirm sustained investment in port infrastructure from the 4th century onward, indicating early recognition of the city's commercial and naval potential. Control of the Bosporus allowed the imperial government to regulate grain shipments from the Black Sea region, particularly from the Danubian provinces and later from territories around the Crimean Peninsula. According to late Roman administrative records, these supply routes became increasingly vital as political instability disrupted traditional grain sources in North Africa during later centuries. The ability to secure food provisioning contributed directly to urban stability, enabling Constantinople to sustain a large population even during periods of external pressure. Roman road networks converging on the city further reinforced its strategic position. Archaeologists have identified milestones and roadbeds linking Constantinople to the Balkans, Anatolia, and the eastern frontier, reflecting continuity with earlier imperial transport systems. These routes facilitated troop movements, administrative communication, and tax collection, integrating the city into a broader imperial framework that extended across 3 continents. Geography did not merely favor defense. It enabled administrative reach. The decision to relocate the imperial capital eastward reflected shifting centers of gravity within the Roman world. By the early 4th century, the eastern provinces generated greater revenue, possessed denser urban networks, and faced more immediate military threats. Constantinople's proximity to both the Danube frontier and the eastern borderlands allowed emperors to respond more rapidly to incursions by Goths, Persians, and later nomadic groups. Contemporary legal texts and imperial edicts demonstrate that Constantine and his successors increasingly governed from the city, reinforcing its status as the operational center of imperial authority. Early fortifications illustrate how geography shaped defensive planning. The initial walls, constructed during Constantine's reign, enclosed a smaller urban area than later expansions, but were positioned to maximize natural terrain advantages. Subsequent enlargements, culminating in the Theodosian walls of the early 5th century, responded to demographic growth and evolving military threats. These fortifications were not static structures. They were modified, repaired, and extended over centuries, reflecting continuous adaptation to technological and tactical change. Harbor facilities formed an integral component of the city's defensive system. The Golden Horn functioned as both a commercial artery and a protected naval anchorage. Archaeological excavations have revealed chain mechanisms used to block hostile fleets, as well as shipyards capable of maintaining imperial vessels. Control of maritime access reduced vulnerability to naval assault and ensured that Constantinople could be supplied by sea even when land routes were compromised. Imperial legislation further underscores the strategic role assigned to the city. Laws regulating grain distribution, port administration, and urban provisioning demonstrate centralized oversight of resources critical to maintaining order. Records indicate that Constantinople received preferential treatment in terms of taxation and supply allocation, reflecting its political importance. These measures transformed geographic advantage into institutional resilience, embedding the city's location within legal and administrative systems. Religious and symbolic considerations reinforced strategic planning rather than replacing it. While Constantinople emerged as a major Christian center, ecclesiastical prominence followed imperial investment rather than preceding it. The construction of major churches, including early iterations of Hagia Sophia, occurred alongside military, administrative, and infrastructural development. Religious authority complemented political power, but it did not determine the city's original function. By the late 4th century, Constantinople had become the most heavily fortified and strategically positioned city in the eastern Mediterranean. Its geography supported sustained imperial presence, facilitated economic integration, and constrained the operational options of potential adversaries. According to Byzantine chroniclers, the city was increasingly perceived as impregnable, a perception rooted not in myth but in the cumulative interaction of terrain, infrastructure, and governance. As geography established opportunity, imperial institutions transformed that opportunity into durable power, setting the foundation for administrative continuity that would define Constantinople's role for centuries to come. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications to receive daily Nightfall history documentaries. You're also invited to comment with the section you find most informative as the documentary unfolds. Imperial survival depended less on walls than on administration. While Constantinople's fortifications created physical security, it was the structure and reach of Byzantine governance that ensured the city's resilience during periods of political instability, external threat, and economic fluctuation. The late Roman administrative model, inherited and adapted by the Byzantines, provided continuity in law, taxation, and bureaucratic oversight that allowed the empire to maintain cohesion across a vast and diverse territory. The emperor remained the central authority, combining military command, judicial oversight, and religious influence. Legal documents and imperial edicts from the 4th through 6th centuries demonstrate the emperor's role in codifying and enforcing regulations across provincial and urban contexts. The Codex Justinianus, compiled under Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century, formalized Roman legal traditions and clarified the distribution of authority within the state. This codification not only standardized law but reinforced the emperor's ability to regulate property, commerce, and civic duties in both the capital and the provinces. Bureaucracy was organized hierarchically, with offices ranging from high-level ministers to lower clerical staff, ensuring both oversight and administrative continuity. Records from the Notitia Dignitatum and later Byzantine chroniclers outline the roles of key positions, including the Praetorian prefect, quaestors, and various fiscal officers. These offices coordinated taxation, legal adjudication, and logistics, integrating Constantinople into a broader imperial framework. The emperor's court also functioned as an administrative center, where policy was deliberated, imperial decrees issued, and envoys received. The cohesion of this bureaucratic network allowed the state to respond to crises such as invasions, rebellions, and natural disasters with a degree of organization unavailable to many contemporary polities. Taxation systems reflected both centralized oversight and adaptation to local circumstances. Provincial revenues supported military campaigns, urban infrastructure, and civic provisioning in the capital. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that grain shipments, collected from regions such as Egypt, the Danubian provinces, and Anatolia, were meticulously recorded and transported under imperial supervision. Legal codes established mechanisms to prevent corruption, regulate collection, and ensure consistent delivery to Constantinople. This fiscal stability underpinned the city's ability to sustain a large population, maintain public works, and fund fortifications, supplementing the city's natural defensive advantages. The thematic system, emerging during the 7th century, represented a structural innovation linking military and administrative responsibilities. While fully developed later, its early roots illustrate the Byzantine commitment to decentralizing defense without undermining central authority. By assigning soldiers to provincial districts with both land and military obligations, the empire created a self-sustaining model of local defense, simultaneously reducing the strain on Constantinople and enhancing the loyalty of provincial populations. Documents and inscriptions confirm that thematic commanders reported directly to the emperor, maintaining hierarchical integration while allowing operational flexibility. Court ceremonial and hierarchy reinforced centralized authority and administrative discipline. Titles, precedents, and protocol regulated both domestic governance and relations with foreign envoys. Chroniclers such as Procopius and Theophanes describe elaborate ceremonial procedures that symbolize the emperor's omnipotence while maintaining clear bureaucratic channels. The visibility of structured administration in the capital fostered legitimacy, which was essential for enforcing policies and ensuring cooperation across the empire's provinces. Records of imperial edicts also highlight the interaction between governance and urban management. Constantinople benefited from regulations addressing water supply, public sanitation, markets, and grain distribution. These practical measures were as critical to survival as military preparation, enabling the capital to function effectively during sieges and periods of instability. Archaeological evidence of aqueducts, cisterns, and storage facilities underscores the material investments paired with legal and bureaucratic structures to sustain urban life. Byzantine political durability allowed Constantinople to endure external pressures that might have toppled less organized cities. While walls repelled invaders, the administrative apparatus ensured continuity of leadership, economic management, and public order. The integration of law, fiscal control, military coordination, and court hierarchy created a governance system capable of responding to both immediate crises and long-term structural challenges. In this way, the city's political framework established the foundation for cultural and religious centrality, enabling institutions such as the Patriarchate and major ecclesiastical projects to flourish under stable, centralized oversight. Political durability supported cultural and religious centrality, establishing Constantinople not only as the imperial capital, but also as a hub of administration and authority. As the empire moved forward, the coherence of governance would prove decisive in responding to both internal factionalism and external threat, ensuring the city's continued prominence across centuries of Byzantine history. By the late 12th century, allies had become rivals. For several centuries, Byzantium and Western European powers maintained complex, interdependent relations shaped by trade, diplomacy, and religious affiliation. Initially framed as mutual cooperation, these interactions gradually shifted toward competition, mistrust, and strategic antagonism, laying the groundwork for the catastrophic events of the Fourth Crusade. Trade served as a primary arena of both connection and conflict. Byzantine markets relied heavily on imported goods, particularly from Italian maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa. Commercial privileges granted to these city-states under imperial charters offered access to the Golden Horn harbors and long-distance trade networks in exchange for customs duties and military support. Archaeological evidence, including imported ceramics, coins, and shipping manifests from Constantinople's harbors, demonstrates the magnitude of Italian presence by the late 12th century. While these arrangements benefited both parties economically, they also fostered dependency and resentment. Byzantine merchants and artisans frequently criticized the disproportionate influence of Italian traders, and records indicate frequent disputes over tariffs, harbor access, and the enforcement of commercial law. Doctrinal tensions exacerbated these economic strains. The schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Latin Catholic churches, formalized in 1054, continued to affect diplomacy and ecclesiastical relations. Papal correspondence and patriarchal letters reveal ongoing disputes over jurisdiction, liturgical practice, and recognition of authority. Byzantine chroniclers, including Nicetas Choniates, noted increasing hostility toward Latin clergy residing in Constantinople, while Western accounts reflect reciprocal suspicion. These religious disagreements were not merely symbolic. They influenced political alliances, legal privileges, and the perceived legitimacy of each power's authority within the Eastern Mediterranean. Political mistrust further strained relations. The Byzantine Empire sought to maintain sovereignty over the Balkans and Asia Minor, while preserving delicate alliances with Western rulers. Treaties with Venice and Genoa often alternated between cooperation and coercion, reflecting a pattern of fluctuating trust. Documents from Venetian and Genoese archives show that these powers frequently negotiated terms independently, sometimes acting in their own interests without consulting Byzantium. Diplomatic missions, including those led by Venetian envoys and Byzantine ambassadors, attempted to mediate conflicts, but repeated breaches of protocol and unfulfilled obligations undermined confidence. Military considerations also shaped these rivalries. Byzantium, facing threats from Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and Slavic incursions in the Balkans, relied intermittently on Western mercenaries. Venetian naval support, for instance, was critical in maintaining control over maritime routes. However, Reliance on foreign forces introduced vulnerabilities. Chroniclers recorded instances where mercenary loyalty shifted according to immediate advantage, deepening Byzantine suspicion of Western intentions. Simultaneously, Latin rulers increasingly viewed Byzantium as a declining power whose resources and territory could be exploited to strengthen their own strategic positions. The interplay of trade, religion, and diplomacy produced a cumulative effect on perceptions of trust and legitimacy. Byzantine officials perceived Western powers as intrusive and opportunistic, while Italian city-states and Latin rulers viewed Byzantine authority as inconsistent and opaque. Evidence from trade charters shows repeated renegotiations of privileges, reflecting ongoing tension and mutual exploitation. Similarly, contemporary correspondence and chronicles indicate that rumors of conspiracy, secret alliances, and diplomatic slights circulated widely, further eroding cooperative norms. By the end of the 12th century, these tensions had reached a critical threshold. While alliances remained formally in place, they were fragile, conditional, and easily disrupted by local or regional disputes. Chroniclers emphasized the growing perception in Constantinople that Latin powers were increasingly unpredictable and potentially hostile. Venice, in particular, pursued commercial and territorial objectives that often conflicted directly with Byzantine priorities, while Genoa's expansionist policies along the Black Sea and northern Aegean threatened imperial economic control. These rivalries set the conditions for catastrophic intervention. The combination of commercial competition, doctrinal conflict, and diplomatic mistrust meant that Byzantine appeals for assistance could be exploited rather than honored. When the Fourth Crusade arrived in 1202, these pre-existing tensions amplified the potential for manipulation, miscommunication, and ultimately, the diversion of crusading forces against Constantinople itself. The structural fractures established in the decades preceding the Crusade, economic dependency, ecclesiastical discord, and diplomatic fragility, created a context in which an allied army could transform into a destructive force, setting the stage for the city's most devastating crisis to date. In 1204, Constantinople fell, not to Muslims, but to fellow Christians. The diversion of the Fourth Crusade from its original objective in the Holy Land to the capital of the Byzantine Empire represents one of the most consequential episodes in medieval history, combining political opportunism, logistical necessity, and pre-existing fractures between East and West. The crusading forces, initially mobilized to support papal campaigns in the Levant, arrived in Venetian-controlled ports along the Adriatic with insufficient funds to proceed. The Venetians, motivated by both commercial interests and strategic calculation, persuaded the Crusaders to redirect their campaign against Constantinople. Contemporary sources, including Venetian chronicles and the writings of Geoffrey of Villehardouin, document this complex negotiation and the pressure applied to reluctant leaders. The initial assault began in late 1203, when the Crusaders reached Constantinople and installed Alexios IV Angelos as co-emperor in an attempt to legitimize their intervention. According to Nicetas Choniates, Byzantine citizens experienced heightened tension as foreign troops camped near the city and political factions divided over acceptance of Latin influence. Despite Alexios IV's promises to repay debts and grant concessions, his limited authority and failure to control internal dissent undermined the arrangement. By January 1204, a popular uprising led to Alexios IV's imprisonment and death, removing the nominal bridge between Crusaders and Byzantines. The breakdown of these arrangements escalated the crisis and set the stage for open conflict. The formal siege of April 1204 marked the beginning of extensive violence and destruction. Crusader forces, supported by Venetian ships, breached the city's defensive walls at multiple points, exploiting weaknesses along the Theodosian fortifications. Nicetas Choniates provides detailed accounts of combat in urban streets, describing towers set ablaze, gates dismantled, and defenders overwhelmed despite the presence of city militias and remaining imperial troops. Archival studies and archaeological surveys confirm widespread structural damage, including the collapse of sections of walls, destruction of public buildings, and targeted attacks on key economic infrastructure, such as warehouses and shipyards along the Golden Horn. Demographic consequences were severe. Chroniclers estimate that tens of thousands of residents were killed or displaced, though exact figures remain contested. Urban populations had already declined in the previous century due to plague, famine, and emigration, but the combined effect of siege casualties, massacres, and mass flight represented a dramatic contraction of the city's human capital. Contemporary accounts also note the deportation of skilled artisans, craftsmen, and administrators to Western Europe, disrupting traditional urban production and administration. These losses weakened the empire's ability to recover economically and administratively. The economic impact of the sack was equally profound. Crusaders looted treasures from the imperial palace, churches, and private residences, removing gold, silver, manuscripts, and liturgical objects. The Venetians secured control over maritime trade routes and port facilities, asserting long-term commercial dominance in the region. Nicetas Choniates emphasizes the systematic extraction of wealth and the destruction of archives, which diminished institutional memory and impeded bureaucratic continuity. Archaeological findings corroborate the widespread dispersal of objects, revealing a marked reduction in luxury goods, urban coinage circulation, and organized marketplaces in the decades following 1204. Cultural and religious institutions were also targeted. Churches and monasteries, including sections of Hagia Sophia, were desecrated, converted for temporary military use, or stripped of valuable artifacts. Manuscripts and iconography were removed or destroyed, affecting both spiritual practice and scholarly continuity. Eyewitness testimony describes Latin clergy overseeing the confiscation of relics and religious texts, emphasizing the exploitative dimension of ecclesiastical authority in the context of conquest. These actions permanently altered the intellectual and religious landscape of Constantinople, disrupting practices that had been maintained for centuries. The sack also illustrates the interaction between pre-existing political fragility and opportunistic intervention. Byzantine governance, weakened by internal rivalries and dependence on foreign mercenaries, proved unable to marshal a coordinated response. Documents reveal conflicting orders between local governors, military commanders, and remaining imperial officials, resulting in fragmented defense efforts. The Crusaders capitalized on these divisions, systematically targeting areas where resistance was least organized. In this way, structural weakness amplified the destructive effect of a comparatively small, albeit well-equipped, invading force. Despite the intensity of the attack, Constantinople as an urban center survived physically. Significant sections of walls, aqueducts, and public buildings remained standing, and the city's geographical advantages limited the ability of invaders to fully dismantle fortifications. However, the social, economic, and administrative foundations were permanently weakened. Trade networks were disrupted, elite families decimated or displaced, and fiscal systems rendered inconsistent. The city's strategic position remained advantageous, but the institutional capacity to exploit it effectively had been severely compromised. By the summer of 1204, the Latin Crusaders established a short-lived regime known as the Latin Empire, installing their own administrative structures while subordinating local populations. Constantinople continued to function as a capital, but under foreign oversight, its resources redirected to serve Western European interests. The disruption of the city's demographic base, administrative networks, and economic infrastructure created vulnerabilities that persisted even after the Byzantine Restoration in 1261. The Fourth Crusade thus marked a turning point. The empire survived geographically, but its institutional integrity and long-term resilience had been critically undermined, shaping the trajectory of Byzantine decline for the following decades. Internal conflict proved more damaging than foreign invasion. Following the restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople in 1261, the empire faced the challenge of reasserting centralized authority over a fragmented and weakened polity. The Palaeologan dynasty, established by Michael VIII, inherited a state whose administrative and military infrastructure had been severely disrupted by decades of Latin occupation, and whose provincial territories had been partially lost or destabilized. The political landscape was characterized by factionalism within the imperial family, competing claims to authority, and local magnates exercising de facto autonomy. Civil wars became a recurring feature of late Byzantine politics. Michael VIII's attempts to consolidate power provoked resistance from rival claimants and regional aristocratic factions. Chroniclers such as George Pacimir's record disputes between imperial siblings and prominent generals over succession, military command, and fiscal control. These conflicts frequently resulted in armed confrontations within the capital and in provincial cities, producing destruction of infrastructure and a temporary breakdown of effective governance. The impact of these dynastic struggles extended beyond immediate military costs, destabilizing administrative continuity and undermining confidence in imperial legitimacy. The weakening of central authority had direct economic consequences. Tax collection became increasingly inconsistent, as local governors and magnates exploited their autonomy to retain revenues or levy additional taxes. Fiscal records, including surviving chrysabuls and accounts of imperial estates, demonstrate a notable contraction of state income compared with the pre-1204 period. The diminished treasury limited the empire's ability to fund military campaigns, maintain urban infrastructure, and support Constantinople's provisioning. These constraints constrained both defensive capacity and urban reconstruction, leaving the capital vulnerable to internal unrest and external pressure. Military organization suffered in parallel with administrative weakening. The empire relied increasingly on mercenary contingents, including Catalan, Serbian, and Turkish soldiers, whose loyalty depended on immediate payment rather than enduring institutional obligation. Records of troop deployment reveal that these forces were often used in factional conflicts as much as for defense against external adversaries. The reliance on hired soldiers reflected both the shrinking manpower base of the empire and the erosion of traditional thematic structures, highlighting the link between political fragmentation and operational vulnerability. Dynastic instability also shaped foreign policy and diplomatic interactions. Neighboring powers, including the Latin states in Greece, the rising Serbian and Bulgarian principalities, and the Ottoman beyliks, exploited Byzantine weakness, negotiating favorable trade terms, territorial concessions, or military alliances with different factions. Correspondence from Venetian and Genoese archives indicates that these powers engaged with multiple claimants, leveraging internal disputes to secure strategic advantages. Consequently, Byzantine foreign policy became reactive and opportunistic, constrained by internal divisions rather than guided by coherent imperial strategy. Civic and institutional structures suffered as well. Constantinople's municipal administration faced repeated disruptions during periods of palace revolt or aristocratic rebellion. Legal and bureaucratic continuity was compromised, with records indicating that court officials were often displaced, imprisoned, or coerced into supporting one faction over another. These interruptions hindered the enforcement of tax law, urban maintenance, and public order, further reducing the effectiveness of governance. Archaeological evidence from Constantinople demonstrates the physical consequences of these disturbances, including damaged public buildings and disrupted marketplaces. Succession disputes were compounded by broader societal fragmentation. Regional governors and semi-autonomous lords exercised increasing control over territories distant from Constantinople, challenging the authority of the emperor and complicating attempts at tax collection or military mobilization. Surviving charters and inscriptions illustrate instances in which provincial magnates acted independently of imperial directives, reinforcing the perception of a weakening central state. This diffusion of power impeded efforts to coordinate recovery, reconstruction, and defense following the destabilizing effects of civil war and Latin occupation. Despite these challenges, the imperial family maintained symbolic authority, and periodic interventions temporarily restored cohesion. Michael VIII successfully recaptured Constantinople and implemented measures to assert dominance over rebellious factions, demonstrating the resilience of dynastic institutions even under stress. However, repeated cycles of conflict, succession crises, and localized revolts prevented sustained consolidation, leaving the empire politically fragmented and administratively weakened. By the mid-14th century, political instability had significantly undermined economic recovery. The shrinking tax base, combined with fragmented governance and reliance on mercenary forces, constrained the empire's capacity to fund urban reconstruction, military defense, and provincial administration. Constantinople remained the nominal capital, but its institutional foundation was fragile, and the city's strategic position could no longer be fully leveraged without effective central authority. The pattern of internal conflict established in this period would continue to shape Byzantine resilience and vulnerability in the decades leading to the rise of the Ottoman threat, demonstrating the interdependence of political cohesion and economic stability. Commerce survived, but no longer served the empire. In the aftermath of the Latin occupation and recurring internal conflicts, Constantinople faced a substantial decline in both economic autonomy and fiscal capacity. Italian maritime powers, principally Venice and Genoa, emerged as dominant intermediaries in trade networks that had once been under Byzantine supervision, redirecting the flow of goods, capital, and strategic resources away from imperial control. The resulting imbalance limited the empire's ability to recover economically and directly constrained its capacity to maintain military and administrative infrastructure. The Venetian presence was deeply entrenched by the late 13th century. Venetian merchants and shipowners held substantial privileges within the Golden Horn, including exclusive access to key harbor facilities, exemptions from certain taxes, and the right to establish fortified trading colonies. Archival sources, including Venetian trade charters and agreements ratified by Byzantine emperors, document these arrangements and underscore the asymmetrical dependence that developed. While Venice provided essential naval support and logistical services, the empire increasingly ceded revenue streams to foreign hands, reducing its control over customs, warehousing, and urban trade. Genoa similarly expanded influence through concessions granted in the Black Sea and northern Aegean regions. The Genoese quarter of Galata, located across the Golden Horn from central Constantinople, became a semi-autonomous hub of trade, fortified and regulated by Genoese authorities. Archaeological investigations in the Galata district reveal structures consistent with customs offices, warehouses, and shipyards, reflecting both commercial sophistication and foreign oversight. Genoese control allowed them to dominate key commodity flows, including grain, timber, and luxury goods, often at the expense of Byzantine merchants who lacked comparable privileges or legal protection. The consequences of Italian economic dominance extended to state revenues. Tax records and surviving fiscal documents indicate a marked contraction in imperial income, particularly from tariffs and port duties. Customs revenues, historically vital to funding the urban administration and the imperial court, were increasingly diverted to Venetian and Genoese authorities under negotiated agreements. These losses constrained the empire's ability to maintain fortifications, support the thematic military system, and provide for Constantinople's urban population. In effect, the very lifelines that had enabled the city to survive sieges and crises were now partially externalized. Byzantine attempts to assert fiscal or commercial control faced structural limitations. Legal codes permitted Italian merchants to operate under their own legal frameworks, often exempting them from imperial courts and regulations. Chroniclers note frequent disputes between Venetian or Genoese traders and Byzantine officials, including clashes over taxation and harbor usage. These incidents illustrate how economic dependence on foreign intermediaries undermined the exercise of sovereignty, forcing emperors to negotiate concessions they could ill afford. The cumulative effect was a significant reduction in the empire's discretionary resources for military, administrative, and civic purposes. Urban infrastructure reflects this economic reorientation. Excavations in harbor zones along the Golden Horn and Sea of Marmara demonstrate a concentration of warehouses, docks, and fortifications under Italian control, rather than direct Byzantine supervision. Coin hoards and ceramic assemblages indicate sustained, high-volume trade, but much of the revenue and control accrued to foreign entities. The material record corroborates textual sources, showing that while commerce thrived in the city, it no longer primarily benefited the imperial treasury or supported long-term institutional recovery. The decline in imperial revenues had immediate implications for military capacity. Reduced funds limited the ability to recruit and maintain standing troops, repair defensive walls, and supply fortifications. Reliance on mercenary forces increased, introducing additional cost and uncertainty. Byzantine strategic planners were forced to negotiate or accommodate foreign powers to secure military assistance, further eroding autonomy. Military operations, both defensive and offensive, became constrained not only by manpower but also by the structural limitations imposed by economic dependence. Diplomatic relationships were similarly influenced. Venice and Genoa leveraged their economic positions to extract political concessions, influence succession disputes, and shape imperial foreign policy. Treaties and commercial agreements often reflected Italian priorities rather than Byzantine strategic interests, embedding a structural asymmetry into the empire's interactions with both Western Europe and neighboring states. In effect, economic dominance translated into partial political leverage, reducing the empire's capacity to independently direct its internal and external affairs. Despite these challenges, the Byzantine economy retained elements of vitality. Local markets, craft production, and urban artisanal activity continued, ensuring a baseline level of economic functionality. However, the structural dependence on Italian intermediaries meant that these economic activities operated within a constrained framework, with limited ability to fund imperial initiatives or support centralized authority. Trade networks persisted, but the empire's capacity to extract wealth from them for state purposes was significantly diminished. Economic weakness reduced military capacity, leaving Constantinople and the surrounding empire increasingly vulnerable to external threats. The combination of fiscal contraction, reliance on foreign intermediaries, and disrupted internal administration created a structural fragility that would persist into the later Paleologan period. The city remained a commercial hub, but its prosperity no longer translated into strategic or defensive advantage, setting the stage for continued political and military challenges in the 14th century. Imperial retreat created political opportunity. By the early 14th century, the territory of Anatolia had become a fragmented mosaic of competing powers following the collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. Once a centralized authority overseeing trade routes, urban centers, and frontier defenses, the Seljuks had disintegrated under internal factionalism, Mongol invasions, and fiscal instability. The resulting power vacuum allowed a multitude of smaller Turkish principalities, or beyliks, to assert control over former Seljuk territories, reshaping the political and military landscape of northwestern Anatolia. The decline of Seljuk authority was driven by multiple factors. Mongol pressure from the east destabilized provincial governance, forcing local leaders to contend with both external incursions and internal rebellion. Tax records and contemporary chronicles indicate that central Seljuk authority had diminished to the point where local governors collected revenues independently, often redirecting resources to consolidate their own power. Urban centers such as Nicaea, Nicomedia, and Bursa witnessed shifting allegiances as administrators and military commanders realigned with emerging regional powers. The emergence of Turkish beyliks reflected both continuity and adaptation. These principalities, including Karasi, Karisi, and Aydin, combined remnants of Seljuk administrative experience with flexible military organization. Archaeological surveys of fortifications, citadels, and rural settlements reveal a pragmatic approach to territorial control, prioritizing defensible positions and strategic trade corridors. Each beylik established autonomous governance structures, controlling taxation, military recruitment, and local justice, while often competing with neighboring entities for dominance. Economic conditions both facilitated and constrained the rise of these principalities. Control of agricultural land, markets, and trade routes was essential to sustaining military and political authority. Many beyliks capitalized on the decline of Byzantine authority along the Aegean and Sea of Marmara coasts, integrating previously Byzantine towns into their domains. Coin hoards, inscriptions, and commercial records suggest that these beyliks actively engaged in trade with both European and Anatolian partners, ensuring the flow of revenue necessary for political consolidation and the maintenance of armed forces. The fragmentation of Anatolia allowed for experimentation in governance and military organization. Beylik leaders often relied on tribal networks, cavalry-based raiding, and fortification construction to assert authority over dispersed populations. Textual sources indicate that loyalty was mediated through both personal allegiance to local rulers and participation in communal defense arrangements. The decentralized nature of these states, however, also created vulnerability to consolidation by a more ambitious and cohesive power. By the mid-14th century, one beylik began to distinguish itself from the others through a combination of strategic location, military innovation, and administrative foresight. centered around the northwestern Anatolian town of Sagat and the surrounding lands along the Sakarya River. This principality leveraged its position near the Byzantine frontier and critical trade routes. Early Ottoman leaders implemented both centralized authority over internal affairs and flexible alliances with neighboring beyliks, creating a balance of autonomy and integration that strengthened their political position relative to competitors. The collapse of Seljuk infrastructure and the rise of autonomous beyliks also reshaped the regional military environment. Fortifications previously maintained under Seljuk administration required reconstruction, and garrisoning remained localized. Small-scale conflicts between beyliks were frequent, often fought over access to resources, river valleys, or urban centers. Contemporary chronicles record skirmishes in the western Anatolian plains and along key passes, illustrating both the volatility and opportunity of the period. This localized warfare provided a testing ground for military organization, which would later become a defining feature of Ottoman expansion. Religious and social structures adapted to the new political context. Islamic institutions, including mosques, madrasas, and waqf foundations, were patronized by beylik rulers to legitimize authority and integrate diverse populations. Archaeological evidence shows the construction of early religious complexes in urban centers like Bursa and Iznik, signaling both continuity with Seljuk traditions and the assertion of new local authority. These institutions facilitated governance by reinforcing social cohesion and supporting administrative frameworks necessary for taxation and military mobilization. Diplomatic engagement also played a role in consolidating power. The beyliks navigated complex relations with neighboring Byzantine territories, Latin holdings, and other Turkish principalities. Treaties, marital alliances, and negotiated truces were common, reflecting both pragmatic adaptation and strategic foresight. The ability to exploit Byzantine weakness while avoiding costly prolonged conflict allowed emerging powers to expand without overextending resources. By the end of the 14th century, the Anatolian political landscape had shifted dramatically. The collapse of Seljuk authority had enabled smaller principalities to assert control, experiment with governance, and establish localized military dominance. Among these, the principality centered in Sagat had positioned itself to consolidate power more effectively than its neighbors. The combination of geographic advantage, military organization, administrative innovation, and diplomatic flexibility set the stage for a single beylik to emerge as a dominant force, laying the foundation for the rise of the Ottoman state and the eventual challenge to Byzantine hegemony in the region. The Ottomans combined flexibility with discipline. Emerging from the Anatolian power vacuum of the early 14th century, the Ottoman Principality distinguished itself through a combination of ideological motivation, pragmatic governance, and disciplined military organization. Unlike neighboring beyliks that relied solely on traditional tribal networks, the Ottomans integrated Islamic martial ethos with institutional innovation, creating a foundation capable of sustained territorial expansion. Central to their ideological framework was the concept of the Ghazi, a warrior devoted to frontier warfare in the name of Islam. Contemporary chronicles and later Ottoman histories emphasize that early leaders framed their campaigns as both religiously sanctioned and politically strategic. This dual purpose encouraged recruitment from diverse Turkic and local populations, fostering cohesion among warriors who might otherwise have been divided by tribal allegiance. The Ghazi ethos reinforced the legitimacy of authority while motivating military activity in borderlands, particularly along the Byzantine frontier. Administrative pragmatism complemented ideological appeal. Early Ottoman rulers implemented a flexible system of governance, integrating newly acquired territories without immediate bureaucratic centralization. Land grants, known as timars, were distributed to warriors in exchange for military service. Inscriptions and surviving registers indicate that these arrangements established a reliable network of loyalty, while simultaneously creating a sustainable means of provisioning troops. Local governance often remained under pre-existing leaders, who pledged allegiance to the Ottoman ruler, allowing rapid incorporation of territories without destabilizing established economic or social structures. Military organization reflected this blend of discipline and adaptability. Cavalry units formed the core of early forces, capable of conducting rapid raids, securing trade routes, and defending strategic passes. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications at Sagat, Nicaea, and Bialysik, demonstrates that Ottomans prioritized defensible positions while maintaining mobility. Combined arms tactics, incorporating irregular infantry and light cavalry alongside core mounted units, allowed them to exploit both terrain and the fragmented nature of Byzantine defenses. Contemporary accounts note the effectiveness of these strategies against isolated garrisons and rival beyliks, suggesting an operational sophistication uncommon among peers. Economic and logistical structures supported expansion. Control of agricultural land through the Timar system provided both sustenance for troops and revenue for the central authority. Trade routes inherited from Byzantine and Seljuk predecessors were maintained, ensuring the flow of goods such as grain, textiles, and metals. Coinage evidence demonstrates a continuity of local and regional commerce under Ottoman administration, which facilitated resource mobilization for military campaigns and administrative oversight. The Ottomans also employed diplomatic flexibility. Early treaties with neighboring beyliks and Byzantine settlements frequently incorporated marriage alliances, negotiated truces, and tribute arrangements. These agreements allowed the principality to secure borders, minimize multi-front conflict, and focus efforts on strategic expansion. Written correspondence preserved in monastic archives and Byzantine chronicles highlights the careful negotiation of loyalty and tribute, reflecting a systematic approach to regional dominance that combined force with conciliation. Territorial acquisition followed both opportunistic and strategic patterns. Initial campaigns targeted peripheral Byzantine towns and weakened neighboring beyliks, creating a contiguous base of power. Control of fortresses, river valleys, and trade routes established a defensive network that simultaneously facilitated further expansion. Archaeological surveys of early Ottoman fortifications indicate deliberate placement along key roads and river crossings, ensuring both economic control and military security. Institutional continuity was reinforced through the integration of existing social and religious structures. Local elites, religious authorities, and artisans were often permitted to retain positions under Ottoman oversight, allowing for continuity of administration, tax collection, and civic order. Endowment inscriptions, waqf, demonstrate investment in mosques, schools, and public works, signaling both ideological commitment and practical governance. These measures strengthened legitimacy, facilitated urban administration, and supported economic recovery in newly incorporated areas. By the late 14th century, the Ottoman Principality had established a stable administrative and military system capable of sustained expansion. Its disciplined cavalry, flexible governance, and ideological cohesion enabled it to consolidate control over northwestern Anatolia, creating a contiguous and administratively integrated domain. The combination of pragmatic administration, martial capability, and ideological appeal distinguished the Ottomans from other beyliks and set the foundation for a state capable of long-term growth. Expansion soon turned toward Europe. With a secure base in Anatolia, Ottoman leaders identified opportunities across the Dardanelles and into the Balkans. The military, fiscal, and administrative systems developed during early consolidation provided the capacity to project power beyond the peninsula, initiating a century-long phase of territorial acquisition that would challenge both Latin and Byzantine authorities. The integration of ideological motivation, disciplined military practice, and pragmatic governance ensured that Ottoman expansion was systematic and sustainable, laying the groundwork for the emergence of a transcontinental empire. Unity was negotiated too late. By the early 15th century, Constantinople faced increasing threats from the expanding Ottoman state while simultaneously experiencing persistent diplomatic isolation. Efforts to secure military support from Western Europe were consistently undermined by political fragmentation, competing priorities, and mistrust between Latin and Byzantine authorities. These failures left the city reliant on its own limited resources, amplifying the urgency of defensive and administrative measures. The pursuit of Western aid was shaped by a complex interplay of religious and political factors. Following the devastation of the Fourth Crusade and the temporary Latin occupation, Byzantine emperors attempted to negotiate ecclesiastical reconciliation with the Roman Catholic Church. Papal correspondence and synodal records indicate multiple attempts to formalize union, particularly through councils and envoys dispatched to Italy and other Western courts. Legal decrees and letters demonstrate that Byzantine leadership was prepared to recognize papal primacy in return for military assistance, reflecting both pragmatic calculation and desperation. Despite these efforts, Western powers were slow or unwilling to commit substantial support. Italian city-states, including Venice and Genoa, prioritized commercial interests over military engagement, while France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire were preoccupied with internal conflicts such as the 100 Years' War. Chronicles and diplomatic correspondence reveal that proposed crusading expeditions were repeatedly delayed, redirected, or inadequately funded. Venetian and Genoese envoys offered limited naval assistance at considerable cost, but these contributions were insufficient to secure the city against a determined Ottoman campaign. The ideological dimension of ecclesiastical union further complicated negotiations. Latin clerics and Western rulers remained skeptical of Byzantine loyalty, citing historical schisms and previous failures to uphold agreements. Byzantine leaders faced domestic resistance from Orthodox clergy and urban populations, who were reluctant to recognize papal authority. Chroniclers, including Doukas and Leonikos Chalkokondyles, note public protests and factional disputes in Constantinople, illustrating that union agreements were politically and socially contentious. These internal divisions reduced the credibility of diplomatic overtures and weakened the empire's leverage in international negotiations. Byzantine appeals also encountered logistical limitations. Sending envoys, negotiating treaties, and coordinating military reinforcements required significant resources, which were constrained by the shrinking fiscal base and ongoing economic dependence on Italian trade intermediaries. Records of imperial expenditures and harbor usage indicate that administrative and logistical capacity was stretched thin, limiting both the speed and scale of diplomatic efforts. The combination of internal resistance, limited resources, and external distraction prevented meaningful Western intervention. Political fragmentation in the Balkans further reduced potential avenues of support. Neighboring principalities, including Serbian and Bulgarian states, had achieved temporary autonomy and were primarily focused on regional consolidation rather than Byzantine defense. Diplomatic correspondence indicates that alliances were contingent and unstable, with rulers weighing Ottoman pressure against immediate territorial and economic concerns. This regional context created a strategic environment in which Constantinople's appeals for assistance were unlikely to be reciprocated effectively. The cumulative effect of these failures was pronounced diplomatic isolation. By the 1420s and 1430s, the city's leaders recognized that military defense would rely almost entirely on internal resources. Emperors attempted to maximize remaining alliances, maintain loyalty among mercenary forces, and organize local militias, but these measures were limited by manpower shortages and structural weaknesses. Administrative documents reveal efforts to centralize fiscal collection and fortify strategic positions, yet external support remained minimal, highlighting the strategic vulnerability of the city. Attempts at ecclesiastical union continued intermittently, with the Council of Florence in 1439 representing the most significant formal effort. The council resulted in a conditional agreement between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, promising Western aid in exchange for doctrinal acceptance. However, Byzantine acceptance of union was largely nominal, as popular resistance and clerical opposition undermined practical implementation. Reports from contemporary observers emphasized the limited material effect of the agreement, demonstrating that theological reconciliation alone could not generate sufficient military or logistical support. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople's isolation was compounded by the expansion of Ottoman power in Anatolia and the Balkans. Ottoman control of surrounding territories restricted both overland and maritime relief options. Western European powers remained engaged in regional conflicts, unable or unwilling to divert substantial forces to the city. Diplomatic correspondence and military records confirm repeated pledges of aid that never materialized in sufficient scale, leaving the city to rely on fortifications, local levies, and whatever resources could be mobilized internally. Military preparations intensified as a direct consequence of diplomatic failure. Recognizing that external relief was uncertain, Byzantine leaders invested in wall maintenance, artillery acquisition, and the organization of professional and militia forces. The city's fortifications, already reinforced over centuries, were upgraded to accommodate cannon and other emerging technologies. Logistical planning focused on provisioning, water supply, and the coordination of local defense networks. These efforts reflected both strategic foresight and the limits imposed by isolation, setting the stage for the final confrontation between Constantinople and the ascending Ottoman state. Gunpowder reshaped siege warfare. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had systematically integrated technological innovation and organizational reform into their military apparatus, creating a force capable of conducting sustained operations against fortified cities, such as Constantinople. These reforms combined the establishment of elite infantry units, the adoption of artillery, and the development of complex logistical networks, reflecting a deliberate effort to modernize both strategic and operational capabilities. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps of the Ottoman state, formed a central component of this transformation. Established through the Devshirme system, these troops were recruited from Christian populations in the Balkans and trained for lifelong military service. Contemporary chronicles and Ottoman archival records indicate that Janissaries were disciplined, highly organized, and directly loyal to the Sultan rather than to regional lords. Their training emphasized firearms, melee combat, and tactical cohesion, allowing them to function effectively in both field engagements and protracted sieges. The Corps' organizational consistency and hierarchical command structure were critical in sustaining operational effectiveness over extended campaigns. Artillery innovations complemented infantry reform. Ottoman engineers, drawing on both local and imported expertise, developed large-caliber cannon capable of breaching formidable stone walls. Accounts from Western observers and Ottoman chroniclers alike document the construction and deployment of massive bombards in campaigns against Edirne, Bursa, and other fortified locations prior to the siege of Constantinople. These weapons required extensive logistical support, including specialized transport, ammunition production, and skilled operators. Their integration into Ottoman strategy represented a shift from traditional siege methods toward technologically enabled, sustained assaults on urban fortifications. Logistics underpinned both Janissary deployment and artillery effectiveness. The Ottoman state established supply lines that coordinated food, arms, and equipment across Anatolia and the Balkans. Administrative records indicate systematic planning for troop encampments, forage procurement, and maintenance of siege engines. Roads and rivers were utilized to move heavy artillery and supplies efficiently, while local populations were sometimes requisitioned to support the army's operational needs. This logistical sophistication allowed the Ottomans to conduct prolonged campaigns without reliance on immediate territorial control or improvised resupply. Integration of combined arms tactics further strengthened military capability. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery were coordinated to exploit weaknesses in enemy fortifications and respond to counterattacks. Cavalry units conducted reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, and raiding, while Janissaries and artillery focused on direct assaults on walls and gates. Contemporary battlefield accounts describe systematic bombardments followed by organized infantry advances, demonstrating operational planning and command discipline. This synergy between different military branches reflected a comprehensive understanding of siege dynamics and the evolving role of gunpowder technology. Organizational discipline extended to leadership and chain of command. Ottoman sultans exercised centralized authority, delegating operational control to experienced commanders who maintained coherence among diverse units. Administrative records and chronicles indicate that positions within the Janissary Corps, Artillery Corps, and cavalry were carefully structured, ensuring accountability, training standards, and efficient communication. Leadership continuity and meritocratic promotion within these units contributed to the army's adaptability and resilience, particularly in complex siege environments. The Ottoman military reforms were also underpinned by a strategic vision of territorial consolidation. Fortresses, roads, and supply depots were developed in tandem with troop deployment to secure operational depth. The integration of newly conquered territories into a functional logistical network allowed the Ottomans to maintain pressure on Byzantine holdings while preparing for larger-scale engagements. This systemic approach ensured that both manpower and material resources could be mobilized effectively for protracted operations against well-fortified cities. By the early 1450s, these reforms had positioned the Ottoman state as a preeminent military power in the eastern Mediterranean. The combination of elite infantry, technologically advanced artillery, and sophisticated logistics enabled the projection of sustained force against Constantinople, whose walls had previously withstood decades of attacks. Ottoman preparatory campaigns, sieges of surrounding fortresses, and reconnaissance operations reflected the practical application of these reforms, transforming theoretical capability into operational readiness. Leadership would determine execution. The presence of an organized, disciplined, and technologically capable army alone was insufficient. Effective coordination and strategic vision were required to translate institutional reforms into battlefield success. Commanders were tasked with synchronizing artillery bombardments, infantry assaults, and logistical support, maintaining cohesion under combat stress, and adapting tactics to the evolving defensive measures of Constantinople. This intersection of military innovation, administrative oversight, and strategic leadership ultimately defined the effectiveness of the Ottoman approach to siege warfare, setting the stage for the decisive confrontation that would determine the city's fate. The defense relied on centuries-old fortifications. By April 1453, Constantinople's leadership faced the daunting task of preparing the city for a siege by the ascending Ottoman army. The city's walls, most prominently the Theodosian system constructed in the 5th century, provided formidable physical barriers. Archaeological surveys and contemporary accounts confirm that the inner and outer walls, reinforced with towers and ditches, remained largely intact and strategically oriented to resist both siege engines and concentrated assaults. These fortifications were supplemented by the Golden Horn harbor chain and smaller gates, which allowed control over maritime access and limited potential breaches from naval forces. Manpower for the defense was both limited and diverse. Estimates from contemporary sources suggest that Constantine XI Palaiologos commanded a force of approximately 7,000 soldiers, including professional troops, militia levies, and foreign volunteers, such as Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani. Chroniclers, including Doukas, note the challenge of integrating these heterogeneous forces into a cohesive defensive strategy. Soldiers were stationed along quay walls, with artillery positioned at towers to provide overlapping fields of fire, while reserves were held near the inner fortifications to respond to potential breakthroughs. Fortification maintenance and adaptation were critical. Byzantine engineers and laborers worked to repair sections weakened by age or previous sieges, reinforcing masonry, repairing gates, and constructing wooden platforms for artillery placement. Contemporary letters and imperial records indicate the use of available cannons, including bronze bombardments, despite their limited range and slow rate of fire. The integration of new gunpowder technology into ancient defensive systems represented a pragmatic effort to enhance traditional fortifications without abandoning proven architectural strategies. Logistical planning extended to supply storage and civilian management. Food, water, and munitions were stockpiled in central warehouses and dispersed across districts to reduce vulnerability to concentrated attack. Documents from imperial archives record the allocation of rations, the organization of bakeries, and the preparation of cisterns, reflecting systematic planning under constrained resources. Civilians were incorporated into the defense effort, performing labor, managing supplies, and, in some cases, joining militia units, highlighting the interdependence of urban population and military readiness. Command structure emphasized centralized coordination under Constantine XI. The emperor maintained oversight of the entire defensive operation, issuing orders to sector commanders and mediating disputes among mercenary and local forces. Historical accounts describe Constantine personally inspecting walls, deploying reserves where needed, and coordinating artillery and infantry placements. This direct leadership helped maintain order and operational coherence, compensating in part for numerical inferiority relative to the approaching Ottoman forces. The defenders also exploited the city's natural and geographic advantages. The peninsula's configuration limited the number of approaches for a large attacking force, concentrating potential assaults along the landward Theodosian walls and the Golden Horn coastline. Towers and bastions were positioned to maximize visibility and overlapping fields of fire, while ditches and external obstacles impeded siege engines. Strategic positioning of artillery and archers allowed defenders to target enemy formations at multiple ranges, integrating physical geography with human and technological resources. Preparation also included psychological and strategic signaling. Constantine XI sought to project confidence to both the civilian population and allied mercenaries, emphasizing readiness and disciplined organization. Contemporary chronicles note efforts to maintain morale through visible leadership, the distribution of arms, and the display of defensive improvements. These measures reinforced the credibility of command and helped mitigate the destabilizing effects of prolonged anticipation of attack. Despite these measures, the defensive forces faced significant limitations. The city's population had declined over the previous century, reducing the pool of potential militia. Resources were constrained by previous economic contraction and Italian dominance over trade, limiting both the quantity and quality of provisions, weaponry, and repair materials. The integration of heterogeneous forces, including foreign mercenaries and local volunteers, required careful management to maintain unity under the stress of imminent siege. By the end of April 1453, Constantinople's defensive preparations were complete, combining centuries of fortification, careful allocation of manpower, strategic positioning, and logistical foresight. The city's walls, though ancient, were reinforced with contemporary artillery, while the garrison was organized under centralized command. These measures created a defensive system capable of withstanding sustained assault, but the numerical superiority and technological advances of the Ottoman forces would soon test the limits of even these well-prepared fortifications. Ottoman troops began to amass on the surrounding plains and at strategic crossing points, signaling the imminent commencement of a siege that would challenge the city's centuries-old resilience. Artillery replaced attrition. As the Ottoman forces gathered outside Constantinople in April 1453, their approach reflected a deliberate shift from traditional siege techniques toward a technologically enhanced strategy. Under Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottomans integrated large-scale cannon deployment, coordinated infantry and cavalry maneuvers, and a naval blockade, creating a comprehensive system designed to overcome both the physical fortifications of the Theodosian walls and the logistical resilience of the city. Central to this strategy was the use of heavy artillery, including massive bombards engineered by Hungarian and Ottoman craftsmen. Contemporary accounts, particularly by Venetian chroniclers and Ottoman historians, describe the construction and deployment of these cannons, some capable of firing stone balls exceeding 500 kilograms. Fortifications that had withstood centuries of attack were now subject to sustained bombardment. The positioning of artillery emplacements targeted structural weak points, with successive rounds designed to create breaches large enough for infantry assault. These innovations reflected both the technical skill of the engineers and a strategic understanding of siege physics. The siege also incorporated integrated infantry and auxiliary forces. Janissary units, supported by Anatolian levies and auxiliary cavalry, were positioned to exploit breaches or weak points as they emerged. Archers and light infantry secured flanks and prevented sorties from the defenders, while mobile artillery units maintained continuous pressure on multiple sectors of the walls. Coordination between these units required centralized command and communication networks, facilitated by Ottoman staff officers and signaling systems, ensuring simultaneous engagement across the perimeter. A maritime blockade complemented land-based operations. Ottoman galleys patrolled the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, restricting maritime resupply and reinforcing pressure on Constantinople. The innovative transport of light vessels overland to bypass the chain boom at the Golden Horn allowed Mehmed II to apply naval pressure where traditional methods had previously failed. Venetian and Genoese ships within the city could not break the blockade, effectively isolating Constantinople and preventing reinforcement from allied Western powers. Logistical preparation underpinned the effectiveness of this combined strategy. Ottoman records and contemporary chronicles indicate careful stockpiling of gunpowder, stone ammunition, provisions, and equipment before the siege commenced. Roads and supply depots were organized to maintain a steady flow to frontline units, while engineers were tasked with repairing artillery and reinforcing siege positions as operations progressed. The Ottomans' capacity to sustain continuous bombardment and field operations over several weeks reflected an unprecedented level of operational sophistication for the period. Psychological pressure was another component of the siege strategy. Continuous artillery fire, visible troop deployments, and repeated feints created both stress and attrition among defenders. Ottoman commanders understood that morale was a critical factor in prolonging resistance. Contemporary reports highlight that breaches in morale often preceded physical breakthroughs, as defenders were stretched thin by both the intensity of bombardment and the need to man extensive fortifications simultaneously. Coordination between artillery, infantry, and engineering units was reinforced by the adaptive nature of Ottoman command. Siege operations were adjusted in response to countermeasures by the defenders, such as reinforcing walls, repairing damaged sections, or launching sorties. Ottoman engineers and officers continuously identified vulnerabilities, repositioned artillery, and directed infantry assaults to exploit openings. This dynamic approach reflected a level of operational flexibility that distinguished the 1453 siege from earlier, more static engagements against fortified cities. The comprehensive siege approach also leveraged intelligence and reconnaissance. Scouts monitored defensive repairs, identified the movement of supplies, and assessed troop deployments along the walls. Information was relayed to commanders to guide artillery targeting, troop allocation, and timing of assaults. This integration of reconnaissance into operational planning ensured that each action was informed by both observed conditions and predictive assessment of defensive responses. By the middle of the siege, the combination of artillery bombardment, infantry pressure, and maritime blockade had systematically degraded both the physical and operational capacity of Constantinople. Walls were weakened at multiple points, defenders exhausted, and supply lines constrained within the city. Ottoman forces had effectively neutralized the advantages of the centuries-old fortifications, demonstrating that technological adaptation, combined arms coordination, and logistical preparation could overcome traditional defensive systems. The siege escalated rapidly as Ottoman strategy converged with operational execution. Mehmed II's forces prepared to capitalize on breaches, maintain continuous pressure on multiple fronts, and exploit any signs of weakness in defensive coordination. The integration of artillery, infantry, and naval elements represented a decisive shift in siege methodology, setting the stage for a concentrated final assault and illustrating how the combination of technological innovation and disciplined organization transformed warfare in the Eastern Mediterranean. Structural limits met technological force. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of sustained bombardment and coordinated Ottoman pressure, key sections of Constantinople's fortifications finally gave way. The Theodosian walls, despite centuries of resilience, had reached the threshold of their structural capacity. Contemporary accounts, including those of the chronicler Niccolò Barbaro and Ottoman historian Tursun Beg, describe successive cannon strikes that weakened the walls, dislodging masonry and creating openings through which infantry could advance. Tactical vulnerabilities compounded the effects of artillery. Certain stretches of the landward walls, particularly near the Gate of St. Romanus, had been subjected to repeated bombardment and were less reinforced than central sectors. Defenders were concentrated along the inner and central bastions, leaving peripheral positions comparatively thin. Eyewitness reports indicate that Ottoman engineers exploited this distribution, targeting less defended sections to create breaches with minimal resistance while concentrating infantry and janissary forces for immediate exploitation. Coordination between artillery, infantry, and auxiliary forces proved decisive. While heavy bombards created breaches, janissaries and supporting cavalry were positioned to advance through gaps rapidly. Simultaneously, Ottoman engineers facilitated the movement of ladders, fascines, and mobile artillery to support sustained pressure on the walls. The timing of these actions minimized the ability of defenders to respond effectively, illustrating the operational sophistication of combined arms strategy and the integration of technological and human resources in siege warfare. Local defensive failures accelerated the collapse. Chroniclers note that exhaustion, resource constraints, and attrition among the garrison contributed to the inability to hold breached sections. Mortar and cannon fire had compromised the integrity of the walls, while continuous skirmishes and sorties depleted manpower. Coordination between sector commanders faltered under the stress of continuous attack, limiting the effective redistribution of forces to reinforce critical points. These operational gaps amplified the effect of each breach and increased the likelihood of local collapse. Defensive adaptations, including makeshift barricades, countermines, and reinforcement of masonry, provided temporary resistance but were ultimately insufficient. Records indicate that Byzantine engineers attempted to shore up walls with timber supports and debris, while infantry engaged in close-quarters defense to repel initial assaults. However, the continuous artillery bombardment and coordinated Ottoman pressure outpaced these measures, demonstrating the limits of reactive adaptation in the face of sustained, technologically enabled assault. Urban geography influenced the course of the breach. Narrow streets, gate complexes, and defensive towers initially slowed Ottoman infantry once breaches were achieved, allowing limited counterattacks and controlled retreats. However, these structural advantages could not compensate for the failure of the primary defensive line. The interplay of damaged fortifications and concentrated enemy pressure created corridors through which Ottoman forces could advance systematically, further destabilizing localized defensive efforts. By the afternoon, multiple breaches were exploited simultaneously. Janissary forces, supported by auxiliary cavalry and artillery crews, entered the city at strategic points, encountering both organized resistance and sporadic pockets of civilian-led defense. Chronicles emphasize that while defenders displayed valor in individual sectors, the collapse of even a single key breach had cascading effects, forcing redeployment and creating gaps elsewhere. The integrated offensive strategy ensured that the Ottomans maintained momentum, preventing defenders from regrouping effectively. Supply constraints exacerbated defensive vulnerabilities. Limited food, water, and munitions restricted the ability of garrison forces to sustain prolonged resistance, particularly in sectors under continuous assault. Contemporary letters and eyewitness testimony highlight that exhaustion and resource scarcity reduced combat effectiveness, contributing to tactical failures in critical zones. The combined impact of structural degradation, targeted assaults, and operational stress ultimately overcame the defenders' capacity to maintain coherent resistance. By the evening of May 29, localized defense had collapsed, allowing Ottoman forces to secure key sections of the city's perimeter. The breach of the walls marked a pivotal transition from static siege operations to urban combat, signaling that Constantinople's centuries-old defensive system could no longer serve as an effective barrier against a technologically advanced and disciplined attacking force. The integration of artillery, logistics, and tactical coordination had achieved its objective, setting the stage for systematic occupation and control of the city's interior. The last emperor died as a soldier. On May 29, 1453, following the breach of Constantinople's walls, Constantine XI Palaiologos assumed direct command of the city's remaining defenders, exemplifying both the personal responsibility of leadership and the structural limits of a collapsing polity. Contemporary chronicles, including accounts by Doukas and Leonikos Chalkokondyles, describe Constantine personally engaging in combat alongside his troops, reinforcing strategic positions and attempting to rally scattered units. His presence was not ceremonial. It reflected the Byzantine principle of centralized, active command in the final defense of the capital. The emperor's last stand occurred within the context of overwhelming Ottoman numerical and technological superiority. Janissaries, artillery units, and auxiliary cavalry systematically exploited breaches, advancing through key gate complexes and strategic sectors. Despite the defenders' use of remaining artillery, archery, and improvised barricades, gaps in the walls and fatigue among the garrison rendered sustained resistance increasingly untenable. Sources indicate that Constantine coordinated counterattacks to slow Ottoman progress, attempting to maintain cohesion among remaining forces while covering civilian evacuation efforts. The circumstances of Constantine's death remain partially obscured by contemporaneous reporting and later legend. Most accounts suggest he fell in combat near the gate of St. Romanus, fighting alongside both professional soldiers and citizen volunteers. The emperor's body was not definitively identified, consistent with Byzantine practice of burial during wartime and the chaos of urban combat. Chroniclers emphasize the symbolic significance of his death, portraying it as the final act of a line of emperors that had ruled for over a millennium, linking classical and medieval Constantinople to the Roman imperial tradition. Constantine's final actions reflected both strategic intent and ceremonial symbolism. By remaining at the forefront of combat, he aimed to sustain defensive effort as long as possible, protect civilian populations, and signal continuity of authority, even in the face of inevitable collapse. Eyewitness accounts note that his leadership temporarily stabilized sectors of the defense, demonstrating the systemic impact a single commander could exert in critical urban defense, even when structural and numerical disadvantages were decisive. The emperor's death also marked the termination of institutional resilience. Byzantine administrative and military structures, already constrained by demographic decline, economic contraction, and diplomatic isolation, were unable to recover following the breach. The garrison, including professional soldiers and militia, lost centralized command and cohesion, accelerating local surrenders and the breakdown of coordinated defense. Reports of small-scale resistance in isolated districts underscore that some units continued fighting, but without strategic direction or logistical support, these efforts were unsustainable. Contemporary sources indicate that the death of Constantine XI had immediate psychological and operational effects. Soldiers, aware of the symbolic and practical loss of imperial authority, either surrendered or were captured, while the remaining urban population faced disorder and looting. The collapse of leadership translated directly into the rapid consolidation of Ottoman control over key administrative centers, defensive positions, and critical infrastructure within the city. The functional demise of imperial command illustrated the dependence of Byzantine survival on centralized authority rather than purely on physical fortifications. Symbolically, the death of Constantine XI represented the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire. Though the polity had persisted through centuries of crisis, civil war, and territorial contraction, the fall of the capital and the loss of its reigning emperor severed both political continuity and cultural legitimacy. Ecclesiastical, legal, and bureaucratic records indicate that authority had effectively ceased to operate independently, while the surviving imperial family and officials either fled, were incorporated into Ottoman service, or faced execution. This closure formalized the transition from a Byzantine state structure to Ottoman hegemony in southeastern Europe and Anatolia. The final stand also underscored systemic dynamics of empire collapse under combined pressures. Numerical inferiority, technological disadvantage, structural decay, and logistical limitation converged to overwhelm even highly disciplined defenders. Constantine's death was not merely a personal event, but a reflection of the operational consequences of centuries-long demographic contraction, economic dependency, and military centralization that had shaped the late Byzantine state. His fall encapsulated the vulnerability of highly centralized, resource-constrained polities confronting adaptive, well-resourced rivals. With Constantine XI deceased and the walls breached, Constantinople effectively ceased to function as an independent polity. Ottoman forces rapidly secured remaining defensive positions, occupied key administrative and religious centers, and established control over population and infrastructure. The structural and symbolic collapse was complete, demonstrating how the convergence of military innovation, logistical coordination, and sustained offensive pressure could decisively terminate a centuries-old empire. Conquest required administration. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II immediately recognized that military victory alone would not secure long-term control. Effective governance of the city required systematic integration of political, economic, and social structures. Ottoman administrative reforms combined pragmatic continuity with strategic innovation, ensuring that Constantinople would function as both a capital and a base for further expansion. Mehmed II retained key elements of the Byzantine bureaucratic apparatus where practical. Existing tax registers, municipal offices, and judicial structures were adapted to Ottoman purposes, allowing continuity of revenue collection and civil governance. Historical records and imperial decrees indicate that Byzantine officials who pledged loyalty were often incorporated into administrative roles, providing local knowledge while stabilizing the transition of authority. This approach minimized disruption to urban management and facilitated the immediate functioning of essential services. The Ottoman administration also introduced new institutional structures. Central authority was reinforced through the appointment of governors, beylerbey, military commanders, sipahis, and financial officers responsible for tax collection, trade regulation, and urban policing. Archival documents and imperial edicts demonstrate that these appointments were designed to centralize authority while delegating operational control over distinct districts, balancing efficiency with oversight. This tiered approach allowed Mehmed to govern an urban population that had been both diminished and heterogeneous in composition. Fiscal policy was a priority. The Ottomans restructured taxation to incorporate both agricultural revenue and trade tariffs, recognizing the strategic economic position of Constantinople on land and maritime routes. Coinage evidence and port records indicate systematic collection of customs duties from ships navigating the Golden Horn and the Bosporus. By integrating existing Byzantine revenue mechanisms with Ottoman fiscal systems, Mehmed ensured both immediate income for administrative needs and long-term financial stability to support reconstruction and military readiness. Legal continuity and adaptation were also implemented. Ottoman courts administered Sharia law for Muslims while accommodating local Christian communities under the millet system. This dual approach preserved social order, provided predictable adjudication of disputes, and facilitated integration of diverse populations into the urban economy. Archival court records show that Byzantine civil laws were initially tolerated, particularly in property and contractual matters, enabling the city to function effectively while the Ottoman state established institutional authority. Urban infrastructure received focused attention. Mehmed II commissioned repairs and expansions to fortifications, roads, and public buildings, ensuring both security and operational efficiency. Archaeological evidence indicates restoration of key gates, bridges, and water supply systems, while administrative documents record the allocation of resources for public works. These measures reinforced the perception of order and stability, crucial for resettlement and population recovery. Population management was integrated into administrative planning. Mehmed encouraged resettlement of refugees, artisans, merchants, and laborers from Anatolia and the Balkans to replenish the city's demographic base. Imperial edicts, combined with contemporary chronicles, document the relocation of skilled craftsmen and farmers to Constantinople, enhancing both economic production and urban cohesion. These resettlement policies facilitated a functioning labor force while reinforcing loyalty to the new regime. By centralizing authority, retaining experienced personnel, and integrating new administrative structures, the Ottoman state established functional governance within months of conquest. These policies created a framework for long-term stability, allowing Constantinople to transition from a besieged city to a revitalized capital capable of supporting imperial objectives. Administrative consolidation provided the foundation for population rebuilding, economic recovery, and military security, demonstrating the essential link between conquest and governance in statecraft. Demographic rebuilding followed as the next phase of consolidation. With administrative structures operational, Mehmed II and his officials could implement policies to repopulate neighborhoods, restore markets, and organize social institutions. The effective coordination of governance and population movement illustrates how Ottoman consolidation combined strategic foresight with systemic administration, ensuring that military victory was translated into enduring control over Constantinople. Religious change was regulated, not chaotic. Following the conquest of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II implemented a deliberate strategy to integrate the city's religious institutions into the Ottoman administrative framework, balancing continuity for local populations with the assertion of Islamic authority. Central to this process was the transformation of prominent religious structures, most notably the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, signaling both symbolic and practical shifts in governance. The conversion of Hagia Sophia reflected a calculated assertion of Ottoman supremacy. Architectural and contemporary sources indicate that Mehmed ordered the immediate adaptation of the cathedral for Islamic worship, including the addition of minarets, mihrabs, and other liturgical features. This action served multiple purposes. It established a visible manifestation of Ottoman power, facilitated the accommodation of the Muslim population, and incorporated the city's most iconic space into the religious and administrative life of the new regime. Chroniclers emphasize that the adaptation was performed systematically, respecting structural integrity while repurposing function. At the same time, Mehmed maintained continuity for Christian communities through the implementation of the millet system. Ecclesiastical leaders, including the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, were retained as intermediaries between the state and the Orthodox population. Imperial decrees granted autonomy in matters of religion, education, and civil law within these communities, ensuring predictable governance and social stability. Archival documents demonstrate that Christian institutions continued to operate, collect taxes, and adjudicate local disputes under state oversight, reflecting an administrative approach that prioritized order and integration over indiscriminate suppression. The systematic organization of religious life extended to Islamic institutions as well. New mosques, educational centers, and charitable foundations, WACs, were established to serve both the incoming Muslim population and the city's administrative apparatus. Inscriptions and waqf records indicate that endowments were carefully planned to support religious personnel, maintain public services, and integrate urban infrastructure into the broader Ottoman fiscal and governance system. This dual approach, supporting Islamic and Christian institutions, reinforced both legitimacy and functional administration. Religious regulation also influenced urban demography. Muslim settlers, including administrators, soldiers, and craftsmen, were allocated housing and neighborhoods in conjunction with resettlement policies. Christian populations were concentrated in designated quarters, permitting predictable taxation, security oversight, and community governance. Contemporary letters and population records indicate that these arrangements facilitated coexistence while reinforcing hierarchical authority, demonstrating that religious transformation was a structured, state-directed process rather than a spontaneous or chaotic upheaval. Educational and judicial systems were adapted to reflect this dual religious framework. Islamic courts and madrasas operated alongside Orthodox ecclesiastical courts, providing parallel mechanisms for dispute resolution and legal adjudication. Imperial directives ensured that religious and civic responsibilities were coordinated with municipal governance, integrating spiritual oversight into the broader administrative hierarchy. This coordination maintained social cohesion while consolidating Ottoman authority over diverse populations. Hagia Sophia, beyond its architectural and liturgical significance, functioned as a model for broader institutional integration. Its conversion illustrated the principle that religious transformation could reinforce state authority, legitimize new rulers, and facilitate administrative coordination. By transforming central religious spaces while preserving functional autonomy for existing communities, Mehmed established a template for governance that combined symbolic authority with systemic pragmatism. By the late 1450s, these religious policies had established the foundations of an integrated urban society. Christian populations retained cultural and ecclesiastical continuity, while Islamic institutions provided the ideological and administrative infrastructure necessary for the city to function as the capital of a growing empire. The combination of regulated religious change, strategic use of iconic spaces, and community-based governance allowed Constantinople to assume a new role within the Ottoman state, transitioning from a conquered city to the heart of a transcontinental imperial system. The city assumed a new imperial role. With both administrative and religious structures stabilized, Constantinople became the center of Ottoman political, economic, and spiritual authority. Religious transformation under Mehmed II reinforced imperial legitimacy, facilitated social organization, and integrated diverse communities into a functioning urban system, demonstrating how structured adaptation enabled the city to serve as the fulcrum of Ottoman expansion and consolidation. 1453 reverberated far beyond the Bosporus. The fall of Constantinople sent immediate shockwaves across Europe, signaling not only the collapse of the Byzantine Empire but also the emergence of the Ottoman state as a dominant power in southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Contemporary correspondence, chronicles, and diplomatic dispatches reveal widespread alarm among Western rulers, clergy, and merchants, highlighting the strategic and psychological impact of the city's loss. Immediate reactions were shaped by the symbolic and practical importance of Constantinople as the eastern outpost of Christendom. Papal letters from Pope Nicholas V decried the conquest as a catastrophe for the faith, calling for renewed crusading efforts, while monarchs in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire debated potential military intervention. Venetian and Genoese reports emphasize concern for commercial and territorial interests, noting the disruption of trade routes and the potential loss of lucrative markets in the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of the city thus prompted a multi-layered awareness of both religious and economic consequences. Merchants and trading networks felt the effects immediately. Genoese and Venetian trading posts in the Aegean and the Black Sea were suddenly vulnerable to Ottoman authority, and previously negotiated privileges were subject to renegotiation under the Sultan's administration. Commercial letters and port records indicate that traders scrambled to secure agreements with Ottoman officials, illustrating the practical necessity of adapting to a new political reality. The loss of Constantinople altered the balance of Mediterranean trade, emphasizing Ottoman control over key maritime and overland corridors connecting Europe and Asia. Military and strategic considerations also dominated discourse. European states recognized that the Ottoman expansion threatened the Balkans, Hungary, and the Italian peninsula. Chronicles and diplomatic reports highlight urgent discussions over fortifications, alliances, and potential expeditionary campaigns. The conquest demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms, artillery, and disciplined organization, prompting a reassessment of military doctrine among European powers and underscoring the challenge of confronting a state capable of sustained, technologically advanced campaigns. The shock extended to intellectual and ecclesiastical spheres. Scholars and clerics interpreted the fall as both a geopolitical event and a theological crisis. Writings from the period discuss the collapse in terms of divine judgment, historical inevitability, and the failure of prior efforts at unity between Latin and Orthodox churches. These interpretations influenced policy, inspired calls for crusades, and shaped perceptions of Ottoman power across Western Europe. They also encouraged the transmission of Greek scholars and manuscripts to Italy, contributing indirectly to the Renaissance by relocating classical knowledge from Constantinople to Western intellectual centers. European political realignments followed closely behind initial reactions. States adjusted alliances and strategies in response to Ottoman consolidation, particularly in the Balkans and along the Danube frontier. Diplomatic correspondence illustrates shifting priorities, as monarchs balanced the threat of Ottoman expansion with internal conflicts and regional disputes. The fall of Constantinople thus served as both a catalyst and a constraint for European decision-making, creating a new geopolitical environment in which the Ottomans emerged as a central actor. The combination of religious shock, economic disruption, and strategic concern underscored the multidimensional impact of Constantinople's fall. Western Christendom was forced to confront the reality that centuries of Byzantine buffer had disappeared, leaving a technologically adept, disciplined, and expansionist state on its eastern borders. The psychological effect of losing the historic capital of Eastern Orthodoxy amplified the urgency of political and military responses, while the practical necessity of negotiating with the Ottomans reshaped trade, diplomacy, and strategic planning across the Mediterranean. Political realignments followed. European states, responding to both immediate alarm and long-term strategic considerations, began fortifying positions in the Balkans, coordinating alliances, and reconsidering maritime strategies. These adjustments, in turn, created a dynamic geopolitical landscape in which the Ottomans could consolidate power while Europe struggled to adapt to the sudden removal of a long-standing eastern bulwark. The reverberations of 1453 thus extended beyond immediate shock, influencing the trajectory of European politics, trade, and military organization for decades to come. Byzantium ended, but did not vanish. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the definitive conclusion of the Byzantine Empire as a political entity. Centuries of centralized imperial authority, administrative institutions, and territorial governance ceased to function independently under Ottoman rule. Imperial archives, fiscal records, and legal documents were absorbed, repurposed, or discontinued, signaling the end of a distinct bureaucratic system that had maintained continuity from late antiquity through the medieval period. Cultural and societal frameworks experienced parallel transformation. Greek Orthodox institutions persisted under the millet system, preserving religious practices, educational structures, and communal governance within the Ottoman administrative framework. Ecclesiastical records, including patriarchal correspondence and synodal decrees, indicate that Orthodox communities continued to maintain liturgical traditions and local authority, ensuring the survival of Byzantine cultural identity in a modified form. These structures provided continuity even as the political apparatus of the empire was dismantled. Military and strategic institutions, however, were definitively terminated. The Byzantine army, heavily diminished over previous decades and reliant on mercenary forces, ceased to operate as a cohesive defensive force. Fortifications, previously maintained and adapted by the imperial administration, were now controlled and upgraded by Ottoman engineers, reflecting the transfer of military knowledge and strategic geography into a new imperial context. Chroniclers note that while defensive walls remained physically intact, their operational purpose shifted entirely to support Ottoman security objectives. The closure of the Byzantine state also extended to diplomatic networks and international presence. Embassies, treaties, and alliances that had structured relations across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean were rendered obsolete. Surviving correspondence and treaties from Western powers illustrate an abrupt adjustment, as former Byzantine interlocutors were replaced by Ottoman representatives. This reorientation transformed regional political dynamics and necessitated recalibration of European strategies in response to the emergence of a dominant, centralized Ottoman authority. Intellectual and artistic traditions, while displaced politically, retained influence across Europe and Anatolia. Greek scholars, manuscripts, and artistic practices migrated westward, particularly to Italian city-states, contributing to Renaissance humanism and the preservation of classical knowledge. Architectural, literary, and theological continuity within surviving Orthodox communities reinforced cultural persistence, demonstrating that institutional collapse did not equate to total erasure of social or intellectual legacy. The administrative and symbolic end of Byzantium also had temporal consequences for identity and memory. The title of Roman emperor was appropriated by the Ottoman sultans in ceremonial contexts, signaling the continuity of authority over former Byzantine territories under new political structures. Historiographical records, both contemporary and post-medieval, highlight the enduring perception of Byzantine civilization as a benchmark of governance, law, and culture, even after the empire ceased to exist as an independent state. Its influence persisted through localized social, religious, and cultural frameworks integrated into Ottoman systems. Urban populations, bureaucrats, and clergy retained practices, rituals, and organizational knowledge that informed governance under Ottoman rule. Fiscal techniques, legal procedures, and municipal administration derived from Byzantine precedent provided a practical template for managing a large, diverse population within the imperial framework. This adaptation ensured that Byzantine legacies shaped the operational capacity and institutional culture of the emerging Ottoman capital. By the conclusion of the 15th century, Constantinople had ceased to serve as the seat of a sovereign Byzantine state, but the structures, knowledge, and cultural norms of the empire remained embedded in urban life, religious practice, and intellectual exchange. The definitive political end did not erase centuries of institutional development, civic organization, or scholarly achievement. Instead, these elements were incorporated into new systems, demonstrating that the legacy of Byzantium persisted through adaptation and integration, influencing both Ottoman governance and broader European cultural trajectories. If you found this detailed exploration of Constantinople's fall informative, subscribe to Nightfall History for daily documentaries. Enable notifications to follow the full narrative of civilizations, and comment below with which aspect of Byzantine or Ottoman history you found most compelling.